The woman didn't lower her voice. That was the part that stayed with him longest. Not the words themselves, but the fact that she said them in a room full of people and didn't once look around to see who was listening. "You seem like a decent enough man," Vivian Ashworth said, setting her wine glass down on the kitchen island like she was closing a file. "But my daughter has worked very hard to build a certain kind of life, and I think you know, if you're being honest with yourself, that you don't fit into it." Nate Calloway stood in the kitchen of a house that cost more than he'd earned in 15 years and said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say. Because he understood, in that particular way that some men do, that responding would only confirm what she already believed about him. That he was small, reactive, outmatched. Across the open-plan living room, Ivy was laughing at something her cousin had said, her dark hair catching the light from the pendant lamps above the dining table. She hadn't heard. Or maybe she had, and was pretending not to. Nate wasn't sure which would have been worse. He picked up his jacket from the bar stool, thanked Vivian for the dinner he hadn't touched, and left. He'd met Ivy Ashworth 8 months earlier at a hardware store in Barrie. Of all places. She'd been trying to figure out which grade of sandpaper to use on a refinished dresser. He'd told her. She'd looked at him like no one had told her anything useful in years. They talked for 40 minutes in the abrasives aisle. She was 34 and worked in commercial real estate in Toronto. He was 38 and poured concrete foundations for a living, or had been, before the accident that took 3 fingers on his left hand and most of the feeling in his right forearm. By the time they'd met, he was running a small contracting crew out of a workshop in Innisfil, doing renos, flooring, the occasional kitchen rebuild. He had a daughter, Clara. She was 6, and she'd inherited quiet and her mother's stubbornness in roughly equal measure. Her mother, Joanna, had died of a brain aneurysm when Clara was 2 years old. Nate had found her on the bathroom floor on a Tuesday morning in February. He'd never quite stopped being in February, in some small room inside himself. He told Ivy about Clara on their second date. He watched her face the way he'd learned to watch faces, looking for the flinch, the recalibration, the micro-expression that said, "Oh, that complicates things." There wasn't one. She'd asked what Clara liked. He'd said dinosaurs and anything with wheels. Ivy had said her niece was the same, and that it was clearly the correct opinion to have. By March, they were spending weekends together. By May, Clara had started asking whether Ivy was coming when Nate mentioned they were going anywhere. It was the happiest he'd been since February. He should have seen it coming with Vivienne. The signs were there if he'd been looking. The way she asked about his work, with a particular careful neutrality. The way she'd introduce him at family events as Ivy's friend Nate. The way she never quite looked at him directly, as though he were a problem she was still calculating. Vivian Ashworth had built the Ashworth Group over 30 years from a single property management office in Oakville into one of the mid-sized commercial real estate firms in southern Ontario. She had a board of directors, a vice president of acquisitions who wore suits that cost more than Nate's truck, and a daughter she had groomed since birth to inherit all of it. Ivy had the MBA, the designation, the client relationships. She was being positioned, and Nate, with his workshop and his crew of 4, and his daughter who drew dinosaurs on napkins, did not fit the positioning. After that night in the kitchen, things changed between him and Ivy in ways that were hard to name. She didn't end it. She just began to hold something back, some part of herself that had been opened before. They kept seeing each other, but the ease had gone out of it, replaced by a carefulness that felt, to Nate, like pity. In September, she told him she needed time to think. In October, she told him she thought they wanted different things. She cried when she said it. He believed she meant the tears. He also believed she had told herself a story about what she was doing, a story in which she was being kind rather than obedient. He drove home to Innisfil. Clara was asleep. He sat in the kitchen for a long time with the lights off. He didn't fall apart. He wanted to, maybe. It might have been easier. Instead, he did what he'd always done, which was to get up in the morning and show Clara that the world was still there and still worth moving through. The workshop kept him functional. He had A contract that fall to retrofit the interior of a former mill building in Collingwood that a developer was converting to office suites. It was the largest job his crew had taken on. He spent 12-hour days up there, driving the hour and a half each way, leaving Clara with his sister Bev in the mornings and picking her up in the evenings, smelling like sawdust and joint compound. Clara had started calling him Dad the Hammer because he was always carrying one. He didn't mind. What he didn't tell anyone, not Bev, not his foreman Pete, not anyone, was what he'd been doing with the money. It had started 2 years earlier, almost by accident. The developer who'd hired him for a small reno in Wasaga Beach had offered him a stake in the project in lieu of partial payment, 10% of the property, in exchange for knocking $20,000 off the invoice. Nate had said yes mostly because he didn't think it would amount to anything. 6 months later the property sold, and his 10% had become $68,000. He'd put it back into the next one, and the next. He wasn't speculative by nature. He was methodical, almost boring about it, the way he was about everything. He looked for distressed properties in secondary markets, Collingwood, Owen Sound, Midland, was places. Place where he understood the construction bones of what he was looking at better than anyone coming in from Toronto with a spreadsheet. He knew what a bad foundation looked like. He knew the difference between cosmetic damage and structural failure. He knew what things actually cost to fix, because he was the one who fixed them. By the time Ivy ended things, the portfolio he'd quietly assembled was worth, on paper, just over $4 million. He hadn't told her. Not because he was hiding it, exactly. It had never come up in a way that felt natural, and he'd never been someone who led with what he had. He just hadn't thought it mattered enough to mention. He thought about that now, occasionally, in the dark kitchen. Clara turned 7 in January. Nate took her to the ROM in Toronto because she'd been asking about the dinosaur galleries since she was old enough to understand that the bones were real. She stood in front of the Barosaurus for a long time, her head tilted back, not saying anything. Then she looked at him and said, "How did they know it was the biggest one?" He said he didn't know. She said, "Maybe there were bigger ones that nobody found yet." He thought about that for the rest of the day. He wasn't sure why it stayed with him, except that she was right. The absence of evidence wasn't evidence. The things nobody had found yet were the whole point. He heard about Ashworth Group's trouble through a contact in Collingwood, a commercial lender named Doug who knew everyone's business, and was not particularly discreet about it. The Ashworth girl's mother overextended herself, Doug said, over coffee one morning in March. 2 mixed-use projects in Hamilton that came in way over budget. They're servicing debt on 4 properties while vacancy rates are still soft. It's not catastrophic yet, but it's not great either. Nate listened and said nothing. "Heard she's been looking at bringing in outside capital," Doug said. "But she's been choosy about who she talks to, doesn't want to dilute control." Nate drove home thinking about a Barosaurus, about bones and what they told you and what they didn't. He didn't act immediately. That was not how he worked. He spent 6 weeks doing what he always did before committing to anything, looking at the actual structure, not the surface. He pulled public filings. He talked to contractors he knew who'd worked on the Hamilton sites. He drove down and walked the buildings himself, noting the finishes, the mechanical rooms, the loading dock configurations. He ran the numbers 3 different ways. The Ashworth Group wasn't failing. It was wounded and being managed by someone too proud to admit the wound was serious. The underlying assets were solid. The Hamilton projects, once stabilized, would perform. The problem was cash flow timing and the fact that Vivienne Ashworth had borrowed against her other properties to fund the overruns, tying up everything in a structure that was now too rigid to flex. What it needed was a capital partner, with patience and a long enough runway. Through a numbered company he'd incorporated 2 years earlier for exactly this kind of investment, Nate contacted Ashworth Group's board of directors. Not Vivienne directly, the board. He made an offer to acquire 53% of the Hamilton assets outright, plus inject operating capital in exchange for a minority stake in the broader portfolio. The structure was clean. The valuation was fair, not predatory, not charitable, just accurate. He asked for a seat on the advisory committee and standard information rights. Nothing that would feel like a takeover, because it wasn't. He wasn't interested in dismantling anything. He genuinely thought the assets were worth holding. The board accepted within 2 weeks. He found out later that Vivian had argued against it, that she'd pushed to find another buyer, a different structure, a way to avoid the terms. But the other board members had run out of patience with her, and the offer was too clean to refuse. It was only after the deal was signed that anyone told her who was behind the numbered company. He wasn't there for that moment. He'd thought about it, briefly, whether he'd want to be. He decided he didn't. Not because he was afraid of it, but because he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't need it. Whatever he'd imagined feeling when Vivian Ashworth finally understood what she'd been so certain he wasn't. It turned out the feeling wasn't satisfaction. It was something quieter than that. More like the moment after you've finally fixed a thing that was wrong, when you put the tool down and the room is just a room again. The call he did take was from Ivy. She called on a Thursday evening in May. Clara was in the bath, talking to her plastic stegosaurus about something with great seriousness, and Nate was sitting on the edge of the tub, half listening when his phone went. He didn't recognize the number immediately. She'd changed phones. He stepped into the hallway. "I didn't know," she said when he answered. There was no preamble, which he appreciated. "I want you to know that. I didn't know any of it." He believed her. That too was quieter than he'd expected. "I know," he said. "My mother," she started, and then stopped. "Evie." He kept his voice even. "You don't have to explain her." There was a long pause. He could hear something in the background on her end. Traffic, maybe? She was probably in the city. "I handled it badly," she said. "That October. I handled it very badly." "Yeah," he said. "You did." She didn't say anything for a moment. He heard her exhale. "I don't know what I'm asking for," she said finally. "I don't know if I'm asking for anything. I just thought you should know that I understand now, what I let her do. She stopped again. "I understand it." He thought about telling her that he'd thought about her more than he'd wanted to, in the months since. He thought about asking whether she still had the dresser. He thought about a lot of things. "I appreciate you calling," he said. Instead, "I mean that." He stayed in the hallway for a while after they hung up. Through the bathroom door he could hear Clara explaining to the Stegosaurus that it didn't have to be the biggest to be important. He didn't know where she'd picked that up. Probably just logic. He went back in and knelt by the tub and helped her rinse her hair. That spring the Hamilton properties began to stabilize. The vacancy rates came down as the fit-out work completed, and the first commercial tenants moved in. The advisory committee met quarterly, and Nate showed up to every meeting in whatever he'd been wearing that day, because he'd decided early on that he wasn't going to start dressing for rooms. The other members had stopped noticing by the second meeting. Vivian Ashworth attended the first 2 meetings. She sat at the far end of the table and did not look at him directly, and said very little. By the third meeting she had stepped back from active board involvement, citing a desire to transition responsibilities to Ivy. He didn't engineer that. He hadn't needed to. Ivy took over the portfolio management with a steadiness that he had always seen in her, even when she wasn't seeing it in herself. She was good at the work. Precise, patient, harder on herself than on anyone else. They were professional with each other at the meetings. Not cold, but careful. There was still something there, beneath the professionalism, like a current under ice. Whether either of them would ever do anything about it, he didn't know. Some things you don't push. Some things you leave room for. The summer was warm. Nate took Clara to Wasaga Beach 3 weekends in a row because she'd decided it was her favorite place, and he saw no reason to disagree. She built elaborate fortress systems in the sand that incorporated shells and sticks and, once, a traffic cone she'd found washed up near the water. He sat nearby with his coffee and watched her direct the construction with total authority, correcting things that weren't quite level, explaining to him exactly why the drainage system she'd designed would prevent flooding. "Dad, the hammer," she said once, without looking up from her work. "Do you think I could be an engineer?" "I think you could be whatever you decide to be," he said. She considered this seriously. "I already decided," she said. "I'm going to be a paleontologist and also an engineer, in case the dinosaurs need buildings." He laughed. It felt good. It felt clean. He thought, not for the first time, that this was what the whole thing had been for. Not the deal, not the proof of anything, not the moment of anyone understanding anything. Just this. The beach. The coffee. The kid explaining structural drainage to a traffic cone. He'd been called too poor for someone's daughter. He'd lost the woman he thought he was building toward. He'd spent 2 years in a particular kind of quiet grief that he couldn't quite name, because it wasn't only about Ivy, and it wasn't only about Joanna, and it wasn't only about the accident, or the fingers, or the February morning. He'd like to forget. He'd built things anyway. He'd shown up anyway. He'd made sure Clara knew, every single morning, that the world was still there. He hadn't done any of it to prove a point. But, if it had proven one, he supposed, he didn't mind. The fortress was finished. Clara stood back and assessed it with crossed arms and the expression of a person who has done exactly what she set out to do. "Structural integrity," she announced. "Zero flooding risk. Looks solid," Nate said. She nodded once, satisfied, and went to find more shells.